Chapter 2. Spooky Mansion. Stolen? Nancy repeated. The music was stolen? Yes, Mr. March vowed, sitting up in bed with a jerk. The words, the tune, everything. The elderly man suddenly clapped his hands to his head. Nancy, fearful he was about to black out, rushed to the bed and eased him back onto the pillows. Please don't excite yourself about this, she begged. Actually, it may turn out that it was a good thing you heard this. Let's hope the announcer at least mentions the name of the soloist. Unfortunately, the piece ended without the announcer giving the title of the song or any credits to composer or soloist. For the rest of the day, the radio was turned on continuously in the hope that the song would be played again. Nancy and Mr. March waited attentively all day, but up to the time he was ready to go to sleep that evening, neither of them heard the melody again. He was positive, though, that it was one of his son's compositions. Phip was very talented, he declared proudly, as Nancy smoothed the bedsheets and turned his pillows. Why, my son could play 6 different instruments. When he lived at home, he would lock himself in the attic and compose for hours at a time. Then, when the pieces were finished, he would come downstairs to the music room and play them for the family. Do you know of anyone who might have stolen your son's work? Nancy asked thoughtfully. Mr. March shook his head. The young detective realized that she would have to proceed cautiously in any investigation. She could not accuse a person of plagiarism until there was proof. Her task was now twofold: to locate the thief and trace the rest of the unpublished music. She and Mr. March read Phip's letters again, but as before, Nancy could find no clue in any of them. She said slowly, I suppose you've searched the music room and the rest of your home for your son's songs? Oh, many times, but to no avail. How about the attic? I've looked there too, the man replied. The songs are missing, and it's my belief now, after hearing the one over the radio, that maybe all of them have been stolen. Nancy wondered if the person who had tried to harm Mr. March was involved in the theft. The man probably followed him. When the assailant learned he was coming to consult a lawyer, he tried to keep him from doing anything more, the young detective said to herself. No report had been received from the police, so Nancy assumed they had no leads to the attacker. The next afternoon, when the doctor pronounced Mr. March strong enough to go home, Nancy said she would take him there in her car. After an early supper, she invited Bess and George to accompany them. I'm sorry to have you see my estate so run down, the elderly man said as they rode along. There was a time when it was one of the show places of River Heights. The evening was gloomy. As the car approached the river, dark storm clouds scudded across the sky. There's the house, beyond this pine grove. Turn here, Mr. March directed. He was in the front seat of the convertible. It's called Pleasant Hedges. The name hardly suited the estate, for the hedges were untrimmed and entangled with weeds and small stray bushes. Long grass and weeds covered the lawn. Several tall pine trees stood near the house. The wind whispered dismally through the swaying boughs. It's spooky, Bess said in a hushed voice to George, who was next to her in the rear seat. That man who threw the rock at Mr. March may be hiding here, waiting to attack us. "We'd better keep our eyes open," George answered. The house was a rambling structure, partly covered with vines. There was a gray stone section at one end, but the rest was built of clapboards, which were badly weather-beaten. "Now that we're here, may we look inside the house, Mr. March?" Nancy asked as she pulled up at the front door. "Maybe the four of us together can find that lost music." "I'll be grateful if you try," he replied. "Your young eyes, no doubt, are sharper than mine." As Nancy gazed at the stone wing, she thought that it appeared to be much older than the rest of the house, and asked Mr. March about it. "That part was built way back when people around here had plenty of servants," he explained. "We'll go in there first." He led his callers along a weed-grown path to some moss-covered steps. "The lower level of the old building was a stable," Mr. March explained. The girls descended the steps, snapped on a light, and looked inside the stable. It was dirty and cobwebby from years of disuse. The long rows of empty stalls, each with a name posted above it, fascinated them. "Running Mate," Bess read aloud. "And here's another, Kentucky Blue. How interesting!" "Those were the names of two of my grandfather's horses," Mr. March explained. "Great racers they were in their day. The Marches kept a stable which was known throughout the country. The trainers lived upstairs." He pointed to a narrow stairway. The girls climbed up, clicked on overhead lights, and glanced into the small bedrooms which ran off a center hallway. Nancy looked around carefully for any possible hiding places in the walls or floors where Phip March might have put the music he had composed. She did not see one anywhere. The three girls descended the antique stairway, which groaned beneath their weight. Mr. March escorted them back to the main entrance of the house. He took a large brass key from his pocket and, after several attempts, succeeded in unlocking the heavy old door. It swung open with a grating sound. "The place is pretty bare," the owner said with a sigh. "I've sold nearly all the good furniture. Had to do it to raise money for little Susan." The girls walked into the long, empty hall, which sent out hollow echoes when the visitors spoke. From there, Mr. March led them to the music room. The only furniture in it was an old-fashioned piano with yellowed keys and a threadbare chair in front of it. Several other rooms on the first floor were empty and dismal. Heavy silken draperies, once beautiful, but now faded and worn, hung at some of the windows. The dining room still had its walnut table, chairs, and buffet, but a built-in corner cupboard was bare. "I sold the fine old glass and china that used to be in there," Mr. March said to Nancy in a strained voice. "It seemed best. Come, we'll go upstairs now." Some of the bedrooms on the second floor were furnished, but they did not contain the lovely old mahogany or walnut bedsteads and bureaus one might have expected. A few inexpensive modern pieces had taken the place of those which had been sold. Realizing how desperately Mr. March needed money, Nancy kept her eyes open for any objects which could be sold to antique dealers. Apparently, almost everything of value had been removed. She asked if the girls might begin their search for the missing music. "Go right ahead," Mr. March told her. For the next 2 hours, she, Bess, and George tapped walls, looked into cupboards beside the fireplaces, and examined the flooring for removable boards. 3 times Nancy inspected the paneled music room. There seemed to be no clue anywhere. "Nothing left to check but the attic," said the young detective to Mr. March at last. "May we go up there?" "I'll show you the way. It's a long, steep climb," he declared, opening the door to a stairway. "I don't go up there very often. It winds me." After getting a candle, the elderly man conducted the girls to the attic steps. "There are no lights, but maybe you can see well enough by candlelight." Nancy chided herself for leaving her flashlight in the car and said she would get it. Just then they heard loud pounding somewhere downstairs. "What was that?" Bess asked, startled. "It sounded to me as if someone might be hammering on a door," George suggested. Nancy offered to find out, but Mr. March would not hear of this. "No, I'll go," he insisted. "You girls search the attic in the meantime. I'll leave the candle." It was so dark in the attic that at first the girls could see little by candlelight. As soon as Nancy's eyes became accustomed to the dimness, she groped her way forward in the cluttered room. "The attic is really very interesting," she said, surveying the assortment of boxes and trunks. She called her friend's attention to a fine old table which stood in one corner. "I believe Mr. March could sell that," she said. "And look at these old-fashioned hat boxes." She picked up one of the round cardboard boxes. On it was the picture of a gay rural scene of early American life. "Let me see that!" exclaimed Bess, blowing off the dust. "Mr. March certainly could get something for this. Only yesterday Mother told me about a hat box like this, which brought a good price at an auction sale." "There are at least a dozen here," George declared excitedly. "All in good condition, too." They were decorated with pictures of eagles and flowers, as well as scenes of American history. 2 of them contained velvet bonnets with feather ornaments. "Girls, this attic may be a valuable find," Nancy exclaimed. "Even if we don't locate the missing music, there may be other things here Mr. March can sell," George added. "Let's—" She stopped speaking as a cry came from below. It was followed by a shout. Rushing to the stairway, Nancy listened anxiously. She heard Mr. March calling her name in a distressed voice. "Come quick! I need your help!" End of Chapter 2.